My husband slapped me in front of his family, declaring he was the man of the house. 5 minutes later, his family sat in stunned silence, watching him pack his things. The sharp sting of his palm on my cheek echoed through the dining room, but it was the smug smirk on his face that truly broke our marriage. 5 minutes, that's all it took to pack 5 years of deception into a single suitcase. Before we dive into what happened next, I just want to say thank you to each of you for being part of this journey. If you enjoy stories of empowerment, consider subscribing. It's free and helps us grow this amazing community. Now, let's continue. I always knew this day would come, though I never imagined it unfolding during his mother's prized Sunday roast dinner. The table was set with her finest china, wedding gifts she had cherished for 40 years in her own submissive marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. James stood there, 6 feet 2 inches of arrogance, his chest puffed up like he was some kind of ruler. His father gave a slight approving nod, the same nod I'd seen countless times before whenever James imitated his father's way of keeping a woman in check. His mother lowered her gaze to her plate, a habit perfected over decades of silent endurance. "I am the man of this house," James declared, his voice laced with a superiority that had slowly poisoned our marriage. "And it's time you remembered your place." The sting on my cheek was nothing compared to the fire burning inside me. 5 years of quiet submission had led to this moment. 5 years of documenting every controlling remark, every financial manipulation, every calculated move. 5 years of carefully constructing my escape while playing the role of the dutiful wife. What James didn't know was that I had already withdrawn half of our joint savings, legally, with full documentation of my contributions. My new apartment had been secured for months, furnished piece by piece with discreet cash purchases. My new job started next week at a firm across town. Every detail was planned, waiting for this very moment, his final act of humiliation, to set everything in motion. "You're right, James," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. "You are the man of this house." His smirk widened, convinced he had won. His sister, Caroline, shifted uneasily in her chair, while his brother, Michael, suddenly found his roast potatoes very interesting. The family dance of denial was in full swing. I stood up slowly, placing my napkin beside my barely touched plate. "Which is why," I continued as I walked toward the hallway closet, "you should have this house all to yourself." Confused murmurs rippled through the room as I pulled out the pre-packed suitcase I had placed there that morning. James' face shifted, his smirk fading into uncertainty. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Showing you exactly what the man of the house has earned," I replied, wheeling the suitcase to his feet. "Inside, you'll find enough clothes for a week, your essential toiletries, and copies of some very interesting documents I've been collecting." His father started to rise, but I stopped him with a single look, one filled with 5 years of pent-up defiance. "You might want to stay seated for this part, Richard. It concerns you too." From my purse, I pulled out a thick envelope. "This contains records of every joint account transaction where money was funneled into your private accounts, James. Fascinating pattern, really, always right after my quarterly bonus cleared. And there are also documents showing the consulting fees paid to your father's defunct company. Creative tax evasion, I must say." The color drained from both their faces. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass, while Caroline's eyes widened in a mix of horror and, was that admiration? "You can't prove anything," James sputtered, but his voice lacked confidence. "Actually, I can," I said smoothly. "My father didn't just teach me how to be a good wife, James. He taught me how to be an excellent accountant. Those skills came in quite handy while building my case over the past 3 years." Silence filled the room. 5 years of careful observation had taught me exactly where to plant each verbal dagger. The perfect illusion of family superiority was cracking, and through those cracks, decades of suppressed truths were seeping out. "You have until tomorrow evening to collect the rest of your things," I stated firmly. "After that, the locks will be changed, and the documents will be sent to the relevant authorities. Unless, of course, you decide to make this difficult." As I turned to leave, Eleanor's quiet voice broke the silence. "Sarah, where will he go?" I paused at the door, allowing myself a small moment of satisfaction. Perhaps he can stay in the house of the man he learned so much from. After all, Isn't that what family is for? The last thing I heard as I walked out was James' mother beginning to cry. Not for her son's misfortune, I suspected, but for the 30 years of her own silence she could never get back. Sometimes, a perfect illusion needs to shatter for real strength to emerge. As I drove away from the house that had been my prison, I realized something. Revenge wasn't just about getting even. It was about reclaiming the power that had always been mine. The house that used to be our home faded in the distance as the weight of what had just happened finally sank in. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and I pulled over, the reality of the past 30 minutes crashing down on me. The sting on my cheek had dulled, but the imprint of his hand felt like a permanent mark, not of shame, but as the final push I had been waiting for. In the rearview mirror, I could see the redness blooming where he had struck me, a visible reminder of 5 years of psychological warfare. The family dinner had started like any other Sunday gathering. Eleanor had prepared her signature roast, setting the table with the precision of a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of domestic performance. I arrived early to help, as was expected of the dutiful daughter-in-law, watching her fuss over the placement of every fork and knife. "James has been under so much pressure at work lately," she had said as we arranged the flower centerpiece. "Men carry such heavy burdens as providers." The same old script. The same excuses she had probably used to justify her own husband's behavior for years. But the breaking point hadn't come with the slap. No, it had been building long before his palm met my cheek. It was in the way he criticized my choice of wine for dinner. "Honestly, Sarah, after 5 years, you still can't remember I prefer Cabernet with roast?" The slight shake of his father's head. The uncomfortable silence around the table. It was in how he interrupted me 3 times as I tried to share news about my latest project at work. "Darling, I'm sure nobody wants to hear about spreadsheets during dinner," he had said, flashing that condescending smile, the same smile he wore moments before his hand struck my face. Then came the inevitable conversation about the roles of men and women in marriage. Richard, James's father, had taken the floor, speaking with the confidence of a man convinced he was delivering universal truths. "The problem with modern marriages," he declared, swirling his wine with authority, "is that women have forgotten the natural order of things. A man must lead his household." I made the mistake of disagreeing, politely, of course, as I had been trained to do over the years. "Actually, I believe in partnership and mutual respect." The sound of James's hand slamming against the table cut through the room like a gunshot. "Enough. I won't have my wife contradicting my father in my own home." And that's when it happened. The slap that echoed through the dining room. The culmination of years of suppressed dignity. But what followed, that was the real breaking point. His smirk. That self-satisfied expression of a man who believed he had finally put his wife in her place. The way his family froze, not in horror at his actions, but in anticipation of my submission. They expected tears. They expected apologies. They expected the same pattern they had witnessed and upheld for generations. Instead, they got 5 minutes that shattered their carefully constructed hierarchy. Now, sitting in my car just around the corner, I pulled out my phone. 3 missed calls from Caroline, James's sister. A text message, "I had no idea you were going through this. Do you need anything?" My hands had stopped shaking. In their place, a steady calm had settled over me, the kind that comes with absolute certainty. I thought of Eleanor's face as I walked out. The dawning realization in her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, I had broken more than just my own chains tonight. The breaking point wasn't just about the slap, or the smirk, or even the years of subtle degradation. It was about the moment I chose to turn pain into power, humiliation into action, and silence into strength. I started my car again and headed toward my new apartment. In the trunk were the essentials I had been gradually moving over the past months. Important documents, irreplaceable photos, my grandmother's jewelry. Everything else was replaceable. Everything else had been props in the role I had played for too long. As streetlights flashed past my window, I touched my cheek one last time. The sting had completely faded now, but its impact would reverberate through all our lives forever. Sometimes, it takes a breaking point to realize you were never truly broken, just bent into a shape that was never yours to hold. The next few hours would be crucial. I knew James well enough to predict his reactions. First disbelief, then anger, then desperate attempts to regain control. But I was done being the supporting actress in his performance of masculinity. The breaking point had shattered more than just our marriage. It had shattered the foundation of his so-called authority. And as I pulled into the parking lot of my new building, I allowed myself a small smile. The real show was just beginning. As I inserted the key into my new apartment door, memories of the past 3 years flooded my mind. Every meticulous plan, every calculated move. This wasn't just an escape, it was an elaborate chess game where every piece had been positioned with surgical precision. I walked into the modestly furnished space, so different from the opulent house I had just left. The furniture here was all mine, purchased piece by piece with cash withdrawn in small amounts over months. Each item represented a step toward freedom, a quiet act of defiance against James's control over our finances. Opening my laptop, I accessed the secret email account I had created years ago. Inside were folders of evidence, each meticulously organized and backed up in multiple locations. This wasn't just my new beginning. This was justice, long overdue. Multiple secure clouds. I clicked through them now, remembering how each piece had come together. Year 1. The first signs were subtle, James's insistence on making joint financial decisions that were, in reality, his alone. Money mysteriously vanished from our accounts into his private investments. That's when I started documenting everything, creating spreadsheets to track every suspicious transaction and financial manipulation. Being an accountant had its advantages. I knew exactly where to look and what to record. My fingers hovered over a folder labeled Family Finances. Inside were records of the money laundering scheme between James and his father, consulting fees paid to a defunct company, tax evasion disguised as business losses. I had discovered it purely by accident while organizing our tax returns, but it had become the cornerstone of my leverage. Year 2. The psychological documentation began. I started keeping audio recordings of our conversations, especially when he had too much to drink and his mask slipped. The verbal abuse, the gaslighting, all carefully time-stamped and archived. There were videos too, seemingly innocent family gatherings where his controlling behavior was on full display, though subtle enough that most wouldn't notice unless they knew what to look for. I opened another folder containing emails from my therapist, documenting sessions where I discussed the emotional abuse. She had been instrumental in helping me maintain my sanity while building my case, teaching me techniques to appear compliant while secretly strengthening my resolve. Year 3. The physical preparations began. I started hiding cash, never enough to raise suspicion. I opened a separate bank account using my office address for correspondence. Every bonus I earned was split. Half went into our joint account as expected, and half was secretly diverted to my escape fund. I clicked through photos of bruises, not from direct physical abuse, but from accidents that happened when James was angry. A pushed door here, a grabbed arm there, all photographed, dated, and witnessed by my doctor, building a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. The most crucial folder contained recordings of his father's drunken confessions at family gatherings. Richard, so proud of his business acumen, had no idea that his boasting about tax strategies was being carefully documented. The recording from last Christmas was particularly damning. His detailed explanation of how he taught James to manipulate company accounts would be especially interesting to the IRS. Standing up from my laptop, I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of wine, not James's preferred Cabernet, but my favorite Pinot Noir that I had never been allowed to buy. The irony wasn't lost on me. While James thought he controlled every aspect of our lives, I had been quietly building an arsenal that could destroy him. My phone buzzed again, more messages from his family. I opened Caroline's text, "Mom's hysterical. Dad's threatening legal action. Are you sure you want to do this?" I smiled, remembering the look on Richard's face when I had mentioned those consulting fees. He knew as well as I did that legal action would only expose their carefully hidden financial misdeeds. Their threats were as empty as their moral superiority. Opening my journal, the real one, not the decoy I had left for James to find, I began to write about today's events. This journal, along with its predecessors, documented every step of my preparation, every moment of clarity that led to tonight's confrontation. These weren't just diary entries. They were a testament to years of silent resistance. The clock struck midnight, and I realized I had been sitting there for hours, surrounded by the evidence of my patient revenge. Tomorrow, James would probably try to access our joint accounts, only to find I had already withdrawn my legal share. He'd call his lawyer, only to realize that any legal action would trigger the release of documents he couldn't afford to have exposed. I closed my laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. 3 years of preparation had culminated in 5 minutes of perfect execution. 3 years of playing the submissive wife while secretly building the case that would ultimately set me free. The hardest part hadn't been gathering the evidence or setting up the escape plan. The hardest part had been maintaining the facade, smiling at family dinners while recording their incriminating conversations, playing the dutiful wife while documenting every financial transaction, pretending not to notice the subtle warning signs while photographing and dating them all. But patience, as they say, is a virtue, and revenge, when served cold after years of careful preparation, is all the sweeter for the wait. The morning after my escape brought exactly what I had anticipated: chaos. By 7 a.m., my phone was flooded with messages, missed calls, and voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. I watched them roll in while sipping my morning coffee, feeling strangely detached from the storm. "Sarah, you're being irrational. Come home, and we can discuss this like adults." James, 6:15 a.m. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to this family?" Richard, 6:45 a.m. "Please, darling, let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." Eleanor, 7 a.m. I had already set my plan in motion. My lawyer, Patricia Chin, had been fully briefed for months. At exactly 8 a.m., as planned, she started sending out a series of strategically crafted emails. The first went to James's law firm, outlining the financial discrepancies I had uncovered. The second was sent to his father's business partners, subtly hinting at irregularities in their consulting arrangements. I replayed yesterday's events in my mind, the critical 5 minutes after the slap. The way I stayed composed while retrieving his packed suitcase. The precision with which I laid out the evidence. The calculated way I revealed just enough to show them I was in control without exposing my full strategy. At 9 a.m., the doorbell rang. Peering through the peephole, I saw James. His usual polished appearance was gone, his tie askew, his hair disheveled. The man who once insisted on perfect presentation was unraveling, just as I had anticipated. "Sarah," he called through the door. "This is ridiculous. Open the door." I pressed record on my phone, another habit formed over years of preparation. "James, step away from the door. Any attempt at forced entry will be reported to the authorities." "You can't do this to me. I'm your husband." "The same husband who slapped me in front of his family?" My voice remained steady, controlled. "The security cameras in this building are recording everything, James. It's your choice how you want this to look in the divorce proceedings." A loud thud followed, a punch against the wall. Predictable. James had always resorted to physical displays when he felt powerless. The difference now was that every action of his only strengthened my case. My phone buzzed with a message from Caroline. "He's at your apartment. Dad's furious. He just got a call from his biggest client asking questions about the consulting fees." Everything was falling into place. The dominoes I had carefully arranged over the years were toppling exactly as I planned. James's desperate display at my door. Richard's clients raising questions. Eleanor's frantic calls. It all proved that my calculated response was hitting its mark. Through the door, James's breathing was heavy with frustration. "The passwords have been changed," he hissed. "You can't access any of our accounts." I allowed myself a small smile. "Check your email, James. Your father might want to see it too." At that moment, my lawyer had just sent them the documentation showing the new account arrangements. Every joint account had been legally divided, with my rightful share transferred out minutes before I walked out yesterday. The thinly veiled tax evasion scheme between father and son was laid out in clear, irrefutable detail. "You had no right." His voice cracked. "I had every right. Just like you had the right to be the man of the house, remember?" The security guard I had alerted earlier appeared at the end of the hallway. "Is there a problem here, ma'am?" "Mr. Crawford was just leaving," I said, loudly enough for James to catch the warning in my tone. I listened to his footsteps retreat, followed by the ding of the elevator. Through my security app, I watched him storm out of the building, punching numbers into his phone, presumably calling his father. Minutes later, my phone lit up with a call from Richard. I let it go to voicemail, then played it back on speaker. "Sarah, you listen to me. Whatever you think you're doing, you're making a terrible mistake. This family has connections you can't imagine. One word from me." I sent him a single text response. "One word from me to the IRS, Richard. Your choice." This wasn't just about gathering evidence or executing an escape plan. It was about understanding their psychological patterns, predicting their reactions, and countering every move they could make. Every threat had already been anticipated and neutralized. I opened my laptop and sent the final email in my calculated response, to Eleanor. Attached were photos spanning our marriage. Every family dinner where James belittled me. Every holiday where Richard lectured about a woman's place. Every moment where Eleanor sat in silent complicity. The final photo was from yesterday, my cheeks still red from James's slap. Along with the photos, I wrote one simple line: "Sometimes, the strongest thing a woman can do is stop accepting what she's been taught to endure." As I closed my laptop, I realized that those 5 minutes of calculated response had accomplished what 5 years of silent submission never could. They thought they were breaking me, but I had shattered not just their control, but their entire worldview. True power didn't lie in the evidence I had gathered or the threats I could make. It lay in the moment they realized that the submissive wife they thought they had controlled had been orchestrating their downfall all along. That first night of true freedom felt surreal. As the adrenaline from the day's confrontations wore off, I stood in my new bedroom, surrounded by the carefully chosen pieces of my new life. The silence here was different, not the suffocating quiet of walking on eggshells, but the peaceful stillness of sovereignty. My phone finally stopped buzzing. The last message I received was from Eleanor, a simple, "I understand." The weight of those 2 words hung in the space between us. Maybe she saw her own unrealized potential in my actions. Maybe she recognized the roads not taken in her own life. The flying monkeys arrived the next morning. First, the mutual friends. "James is devastated, Sarah. Couldn't you have handled this differently? Think about his career. This could ruin him. Every couple has rough patches. You're throwing away years of marriage over one mistake." I had prepared for this too. Each message received the same response, a photo of my bruised cheek, followed by, "Would you give this advice to your daughter?" The silence that followed was telling. Then came the family pressure. James's cousins, aunts, uncles, people who had smiled benignly at his controlling behavior for years, suddenly had strong opinions about my so-called vindictive actions. Their messages ranged from emotional manipulation to outright threats. But something unexpected happened too. Support emerged from unlikely places. Caroline, James's sister, sent a message that caught me off guard. And for the first time in years, I felt something beyond relief. I felt victorious. She showed up at my apartment with a bottle of wine and tears in her eyes. "I've watched him turn into our father for years," she admitted as we sat on my new couch. "I should have said something, done something." "You're doing something now," I assured her, pouring another glass. My phone lit up with a text from Michael, James's brother. "The family's in chaos. Dad's lawyers are working overtime, but I want you to know, you did the right thing. Some things need to break to be rebuilt." The most unexpected ally emerged, James's young niece, Emma. At just 16, she started a group chat with her female cousins, sharing the documentation I had kept of James's behavior, using it as a checklist of warning signs. "Aunt Sarah showed us we don't have to accept this as normal," she had written. The idea that these young women were learning to recognize red flags early filled me with pride. Building a new support system required vulnerability, something I had almost forgotten how to embrace. I reached out to old friends, the ones who had drifted away during my marriage. I expected rejection, but instead, I was met with open arms. "We've been waiting for you to come back to us," my college roommate Lisa said at our first lunch together. "We always knew the Sarah we loved was still in there somewhere." My therapist, Dr. Martinez, helped me navigate this new emotional terrain. "You're experiencing something rare," she told me during a session. "Most abuse survivors struggle with the aftermath of escape. You're dealing with the aftermath of a perfectly executed liberation. The emotions are different, but they still need processing. She was right. There was guilt, not for leaving, but for succeeding where so many others couldn't. There was fear, not of James anymore, but of the ripple effects my actions would have across generations of his family. And there was grief, not for the marriage I lost, but for the years I spent planning instead of living. Work became my sanctuary. I had already laid the foundation for success, quietly excelling while playing the role of the disinterested corporate wife. Now, free from the need to downplay my achievements, I threw myself into projects with renewed energy. A week after everything unraveled, my boss, Sarah Chin, called me into her office. "I always knew you were holding back," she said, sliding a folder across her desk. "We have an opening for department head. The interview is yours if you want it." The job came with a significant pay raise, but more importantly, it gave me the chance to mentor other women at the firm. The irony wasn't lost on me. While James's career crumbled under the weight of his financial misdeeds, mine was soaring. Each day brought new challenges, but also new victories. I learned to sleep in the middle of the bed, to pick restaurants based solely on my own preferences, to laugh without worrying if my joy was appropriate. Small freedoms that felt enormous after years of restriction. The biggest change was in my reflection. The woman in the mirror stood taller, smiled more freely, and no longer carried the shadow of constant calculation. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. 2 weeks after my escape, I received an unexpected email from Eleanor. "I filed for divorce today. Richard doesn't know yet. Thank you for showing me it's never too late to start over. Would you meet me for coffee?" As I wrote back accepting her invitation, I realized that my carefully planned revenge had turned into something more powerful than punishment. It had become a beacon, lighting the way for others trapped in the same cycle. The woman who had once been slapped at a family dinner was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, not because of the revenge she took, but because of the freedom she claimed. The aftermath wasn't just about surviving the explosion, it was about building something beautiful from the ashes. The coffee shop where I met Eleanor was neutral ground, far from both of our usual haunts. She looked smaller without Richard looming beside her. Her hands trembled slightly as she stirred her latte, the diamond ring she had worn for 40 years now absent. "Richard got the divorce papers this morning," she said quietly. "He threw them at his lawyer and demanded they fight it. Just like James did with yours." The social fallout had begun, spreading through our circles like wildfire. The carefully curated image of the successful father-son business duo was crumbling. Their country club membership had been quietly suspended pending financial investigations. Former friends suddenly forgot their phone numbers. Eleanor let out a bitter laugh. The Ladies' Auxiliary Committee called. They thought it would be best if I stepped back from organizing the annual charity gala. 40 years of perfect table arrangements, and now I'm a liability. Their social fabric was unraveling thread by thread. James's law firm had placed him on indefinite leave while they conducted an internal investigation into the financial irregularities I had exposed. His father's business partners called for an external audit. Their empire was collapsing under the weight of its own lies. That afternoon, Caroline called me, breathless with excitement. "Sarah, you won't believe what happened at Dad's office today. The FBI showed up with warrants, something about suspicious consulting fees and tax evasion." Michael's wife posted about it all over Facebook before anyone could stop her. Social media became the battleground where reputations were made or destroyed. Screenshots of James's threatening messages to me circulated among our mutual friends. His ex-girlfriends started sharing their own experiences of his controlling behavior. The perfect image he had crafted was being torn apart by the power of shared stories. The country club set, the so-called pillars of society who had ignored James's behavior for years, were now facing their own reckoning. Wives who had watched me suffer in silence were being forced to confront their own complicity. Husbands who had admired James's traditional values were discovering that their wives were secretly opening separate bank accounts. Margaret, an old family friend, sent me a message late that night. "I used to think you were overreacting. I see it now. I'm sorry, Sarah. And I need to figure out my own way out." It had started as revenge, but it had turned into a revolution. During my therapy session, I told my therapist, "Wilson called me today." She gave me a knowing look. "Wilson?" The one who once told you that you were lucky to have such a strong-willed husband." I nodded. "She wants to know if my lawyer would meet with her daughter." The ripple effect was undeniable. Young women in our social circle were looking at their relationships with fresh eyes. Men who had never been questioned before were suddenly being challenged on their outdated beliefs. The traditional gender roles that had once shaped our social circles were crumbling. James, desperate to regain control, started showing up uninvited at events, trying to tell his side of the story. But the evidence I had gathered spoke louder than his words. The most damning piece? A recording of him bragging about hiding assets from little women who don't understand business. When that was played at a partners' meeting, it was game over. Richard's downfall was even faster. The old boys network he had relied on for decades proved useless against a federal investigation. Business associates who once praised him were now keeping their distance. The man who prided himself on being a pillar of the community was watching that very community turn its back on him. Eleanor's social circle split into two camps. Some of her friends, trapped in similar marriages, rallied around her with unexpected support. Others, too invested in preserving the status quo, treated her like she was toxic. The book club she had hosted for 20 years suddenly found a new meeting spot. But the biggest shift was happening online. A local women's support group picked up my story. They kept the details anonymous but shared the strategies I had used to document abuse and plan my escape. My meticulous approach became a guide for others. "You've started something," Caroline said over dinner. Mom's divorce gave her friend Patricia the courage to leave David. She did everything by the book, documented everything, planned it all out, and walked away while he was at work. Then James made his final mistake. Drunk and angry, he posted a rant about ungrateful wives and family values on LinkedIn, of all places. By morning, his law firm had had enough. The termination notice was swift, citing behavior unbecoming of the firm's values. Richard didn't fare any better. His threats only dug his hole deeper. The golf club buddies who once admired him now avoided eye contact. His power had always been an illusion, and now everyone saw it. The most powerful moment came at a charity event where I was attending as the new department head. Eleanor walked in, her first public appearance since the divorce. Whispers followed her, but she ignored them. When she reached my table, I stood up and hugged her. "I saved you a seat next to me." It wasn't just about friendship. It was a statement. The old social order, built on silence and pretense, was gone. A new community was forming, where women spoke up, men stood as allies, and respect couldn't be bought with money or club memberships. As spring arrived, so did my new life. 6 months had passed since that fateful dinner, and I had become someone even I barely recognized. Stronger, more confident, no longer living by others' expectations. My promotion to department head came with an office overlooking the city skyline, a daily reminder of how far I had come. My walls, once bare, now displayed my certifications and awards, accomplishments I had previously downplayed to avoid overshadowing James. "You've completely transformed this department," my boss, Sarah Chin, said during our quarterly review. "The mentorship program you started for junior female accountants is exactly what we needed." The board is impressed. That program had become my passion project, shaped by my own experiences. Recognizing financial abuse became part of the firm's mandatory training, teaching young professionals the warning signs I had once ignored. The response was overwhelming. 3 employees had already left abusive relationships after attending the sessions. My therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez shifted from crisis management to personal growth. "You're not just surviving anymore," she told me. "You're thriving. Let's talk about what that means for your future." The word future no longer felt heavy. My calendar filled up with things I had once been denied: art classes, salsa dancing, weekend getaways with friends. Each experience felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. The healing wasn't just mental and emotional, it was physical, too. My body, once tense with constant anxiety, was learning to relax. Yoga helped me stand taller and feel stronger. The woman in the mirror now smiled freely, carrying herself with confidence that came from within. Eleanor was going through a transformation of her own. After her divorce was finalized, she enrolled in community college, fulfilling a dream Richard had dismissed decades ago. We met for coffee weekly, celebrating small victories together. "I found my old art supplies in the attic," she told me one day, her eyes shining. "Richard hated my painting, said it was a waste of time. I'm turning his study into my studio." My journey wasn't just about rebuilding my life, it was about helping others do the same. I started speaking at women's shelters, sharing my story and the strategies I had used to escape. My documentation method became a widely shared tool in support networks. Caroline joined me at these sessions, offering her perspective as someone who had grown up in a household where women had no voice. Together, we created a workshop called Breaking the Cycle, teaching others how to recognize and respond to patterns of financial and emotional abuse. "You know what's ironic?" Caroline said after one particularly powerful session. "James and Dad always talked about family legacy. Well, this is ours, helping women find their strength." And she was right. The real legacy wasn't built on money, power, or status. It was built on freedom. Dating again felt strange after years of being in a controlling marriage, but slowly, I started trusting my instincts. I learned to recognize real respect and appreciate men who encouraged my success instead of stifling it. My first date after the divorce was with a colleague from another firm, a quiet, thoughtful man who actually listened. When he asked about my career goals and genuinely waited for my answer, I realized just how low my expectations had been before. One of the biggest lessons I learned was forgiving myself. Not for leaving, I never doubted that choice, but for the years I spent planning instead of living. Dr. Martinez helped me see it differently. "Those weren't wasted years," she said. "They were your cocoon phase. Every document you saved, every small act of quiet resistance, those were the threads you wove to build your wings." The ultimate test of my growth came when James made one last attempt at reconciliation. He showed up at my office, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. His life had been downsized, his reputation ruined. The old James would have demanded, controlled, threatened. This version sat across from my desk and asked, almost politely, if we could talk. "I've changed," he said, his voice careful. "Therapy, anger management. I'm not the same man I was that night at dinner." I studied him. His expensive suit didn't fit quite right anymore. His hands trembled slightly. The man who once towered over me now sat in my office, surrounded by the evidence of my success. "I believe you've changed," I said, my voice steady. "But so have I. And this version of me deserves more than an improved version of you." As security escorted him out, I felt the last remnants of my old self fall away. I wasn't the woman he left behind. I was someone new, stronger, freer. The phoenix doesn't return to its ashes. It soars. That evening, I stood in my home office and finally took down the last photo from my marriage. In its place, I hung a painting Eleanor had made, a phoenix in flight, its wings stretched wide against a dawn sky. Below it, she had written, "Thank you for teaching me to rise." 1 year to the day after that fateful Sunday dinner, I stood at the podium of the National Conference for Financial Empowerment, preparing to give the keynote address. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same meticulous documentation that once helped me escape had now made me an expert. "Our next speaker," the announcer said, "has revolutionized how we understand financial abuse in relationships. Please welcome Sarah Mitchell, author of Silent Ledgers, Breaking Free from Financial Control." The book, based on my own journey, had become a bestseller in both business and self-help categories. The advance alone was worth more than James's annual salary had been. But the real satisfaction wasn't in the money, it was in the shift of power. James had tried to stop the book's release. His cease and desist letter was framed in my home office, a reminder of how far I'd come from the woman who once would have backed down. During the Q&A session, a familiar face appeared at the microphone. Eleanor, now dressed in an artist's smock splattered with paint, stood tall as she spoke. "As someone who lived 40 years in financial darkness," she said, her voice strong, "how do we help women recognize their worth before it takes decades to break free?" The audience didn't know she was my former mother-in-law. They didn't know her art gallery, showcasing work by survivors of domestic abuse, had just received a major grant. They didn't know Richard had tried to reconcile, only to be met with restraining orders and public disgrace. I smiled. "We lead by example," I said. "We show them that success isn't measured by the size of their husband's bank account, but by the strength of their own resolve. The revenge grew sweeter with each small victory. James's new girlfriend Googled him before their third date, found my TEDx talk on controlling behaviors, and ended things immediately. Richard lost his country club membership when his financial frauds became public. But the best revenge wasn't personal. It was in the ripples of empowerment. The women's shelter where I volunteered named a financial literacy program after me. Former clients from James's law firm sought my consulting services to detect hidden assets in their divorces. My method of documenting abuse became part of the standard training for domestic violence counselors. One evening, Caroline called with news that made me laugh out loud. Dad tried to join the new golf club in Westbrook, she said. They Googled him, and suddenly, their membership was full. But guess what? They just invited Mom to showcase her artwork in their main hall. A local newspaper ran a feature on Eleanor's transformation from country club wife to celebrated artist and advocate. The photos showed her in her studio, surrounded by powerful paintings of women breaking free. The reporter noted that her ex-husband declined to comment. James made one final attempt to regain control. He showed up at a book signing, waiting in line like any other attendee. When he reached my table, he placed a wedding photo in front of me instead of my book. "Remember when you were happy?" he asked, loud enough for others to hear. "Before you became this?" I picked up the photo, studying it for a moment. The smile on my past self's face was perfect, practiced, hollow. Looking up at James, I saw what I had missed back then, a small man desperate to feel big. "Would you like me to sign this too?" I asked, uncapping my pen. To James, "Thank you for teaching me that the best revenge is living well. Shall I date it?" The whispers and phone cameras around us told me this moment would go viral. James turned and left, leaving the photo behind. I added it to my speaking materials as a visual aid, a reminder of the difference between a genuine smile and a survival mask. The ultimate revenge wasn't in James's downfall or Richard's disgrace. It wasn't even in my success. It was in the ripple effect of empowerment. The women who had once envied my perfect marriage were now attending my financial independence workshops. The men who once modeled themselves after James found themselves suddenly single. At the end of my speech, I introduced a new initiative, a foundation providing grants to help women escape financial abuse. The first recipient stepped onto the stage, her voice shaking as she thanked the audience. And so, the cycle was breaking. Not through revenge, but through transformation. Would be announced next month at a gala hosted in the same country club where James had once held court success. I told the audience, isn't about getting even, it's about gaining freedom and then helping others do the same. As I stepped off the stage to a standing ovation, my phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor. "Just sold my portrait series Men Who Would Be Kings. Guess who bought the centerpiece? James's old law firm. They're displaying it in their lobby as a commitment to their new ethical standard." I smiled, remembering that painting, a man seated on a throne of paper money, his crown slipping, while women in business suits walked past him, their shadows stretching longer than his own figure. Sometimes, the sweetest victory is becoming everything they said you couldn't be. 2 years after that life-changing Sunday dinner, I stood before my full-length mirror, adjusting the CEO nameplate on my new office door. No longer just a department head, but the chief executive officer of my own financial consulting firm, dedicated to helping women achieve economic independence. The true victory wasn't in a single moment, but in the realization that I no longer defined myself in relation to James or the past. The woman staring back at me in the mirror wasn't just a survivor or an ex-wife. She wasn't merely an advocate for women's financial freedom, though she was all those things. She was, above all, simply herself. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Eleanor. "Just finished my last therapy session. My therapist says I'm ready to write my own book. Would you write the foreword?" Her transformation had been as profound as mine. The once timid woman who lived in Richard's shadow now owned one of the city's most respected galleries, specializing in art therapy and empowerment. Our journeys had intertwined in ways neither of us could have predicted, both of us breaking free from the same oppressive household to carve our own paths. The final piece of my victory came in the form of an invitation. The National Association of Women in Finance wanted me to lead a panel on financial abuse. This wasn't unusual. I'd done countless panels before. But this time, there was a twist. Among the attendees would be a group of law students from James's new firm, required to attend as part of their ethics training. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Caroline asked when I told her. "You don't owe them anything." "It's not about owing," I said. "It's about showing them that the end of one story can be the beginning of a better one." On the day of the panel, I wore the same red dress I had on that fateful Sunday, not as a reminder of pain, but as a symbol of how far I'd come. The slap that once burned my cheek had ignited a movement, helping hundreds of women find their own strength. James was there, sitting in the back row with his students. He had aged beyond what 2 years should account for, gray at the temples, his posture less commanding. Our eyes met briefly, and for the first time, I felt nothing. No anger. No fear. Not even satisfaction in his downfall. He was simply irrelevant to my story now. Financial abuse, I began, isn't just about money. It's about power, control, and the slow erosion of self-worth. But today, we're not here to talk about victimhood, we're here to talk about victory. As I spoke, I saw the expressions in the audience shift. Young women scribbled notes with fierce determination. Some men shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own past behavior. And in the back row, James sat silently, witnessing the full extent of the strength he once tried to suppress. After the panel, a young student approached me. She glanced nervously over her shoulder at James before whispering, "I'm in a relationship. Everything you described, I never had words for it before." I handed her my card. She slipped it into her pocket. Another seed of freedom planted. Another cycle beginning again. That evening, I hosted a small dinner party at my penthouse apartment. Eleanor was there, beaming as she showed us photos from her latest exhibition. Caroline shared news of her promotion to partner at her consulting firm. Even James's niece, Emma, now a law student focusing on women's rights, joined us. "Full circle," Eleanor mused, raising her glass. 2 years ago, a Sunday dinner tore us apart. Now here we are, stronger for the breaking. The real victory wasn't just in financial success, though that was gratifying. It wasn't in professional accolades or even in the countless lives we'd helped change. It was in the quiet certainty that we had become exactly who we were meant to be, not in spite of our past, but because we had chosen to transform it into fuel for growth. As my guests left that night, I stood on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker like stars. The woman who once planned her escape in secret now planned expansions of her business in broad daylight. The voice that had once been silenced now reached thousands. The hands that had once trembled now held the reins of her own destiny with steady confidence. My phone buzzed one last time, a message from Dr. Martinez. "Saw your panel today. Remember when you first came to me, planning your escape? Look at you now. This isn't just victory, Sarah. This is transcendence." He was right. The final victory wasn't about winning or losing, revenge or redemption. It was about realizing that the woman I had fought to become had been there all along, waiting for the courage to emerge. I touched my cheek, remembering the sting of that slap that started it all. What once seemed like an ending had been the beginning. In trying to put me in my place, James had unknowingly helped me find it, not as his wife, not as his victim, but as the architect of my own destiny. The circle was complete. The story had found its true ending. Not in the moment I walked away, but in the woman I had become by walking toward myself.